we go. Again, thank you all for joining us. And we're real excited that Kimberly Springle and Jen Harris have joined us to present today. I have two kids who've been going to DCPS for their lives. One is in college and one is still at a DCPS school. So I'm really personally excited to hear this presentation. Kimberly Springle, she's the executive director of the Charles Sumner School Museum and Archives. And Jen Harris is executive director of the founder of the Story of Our Schools. So they're doing some really phenomenal things, keeping track of looking at the history of what's been going on in our schools in Capitol Hill. And I'm not sure if the rest of the district, I assume so, but we'll find out. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Kimberly. Thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. Can you all hear me okay? Wonderful. Let me make a little adjustment on my end. And good evening, everybody. I'm so very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm super excited to tag team our presentation a little bit with my good friend and colleague, Jen Harris. We've been working together almost a decade now for the Life of Story of Our Schools project. So I'm very excited that we are presenting this evening in conjunction. So I'm just happy to greet everybody. And this presentation is going to be referencing, well, coming from our site, the Charles Sumner School. I want to share a little bit about the school and the archives, and more broadly, a little bit about the nearly 220-year history of DC public education. If we went through every single event and movement, we will be here all night next week for a long time. So what I want to do is, or what I've done through this presentation is I will emphasize some incidents or movements, as you will, or pivotal moments within the history of DC public education. A lot of those moments are predicated on race and ethnicity and the way school segregation and opportunities within public education has shaped and impacted the system. The presentation will serve as an introduction to our site for those of you who are not familiar with the Charles Sumner School Museum and Archives, and reintroduce for others. I see some folks on here that are familiar with the site, some former volunteers and other friends of the museum. The hope is that you'll engage with us as a future researcher, a contributor to the collection, or at the very least, come and visit us at the museum. So if you see my virtual background, I brought the museum with me this evening. So this is our research library. When you come and conduct research at the Sumner Museum, this is where you'll come in to review and conduct research, to look at old records, look at old photographs, and some of you all are very familiar with this space. Another aspect of this presentation will be related to the significance of the history of DC public education and why it matters, why it is relevant, and how it is being preserved. We'll also discuss various partnerships and collaborations, and that's where we'll get to really highlight one very special collaboration that we always look forward to working with, and that Story of Our Schools project, which really got their kickoff on the Hill and doing a lot of work on Capitol Hill, but other parts of the city as well. And before we dig into some of these other moments, pivotal moments, I must highlight the fact that the Charles Sumner School is 150 years old. And on September 2022, which is September 2nd, 2022, that's a lot of twos, is when we hit our mark. So we are within our sesquicentennial year, celebrating 150 years of the historic Sumner School. And on the slide, you will see two historic images. The one on the left is an 1890 image that is the oldest known photograph of the Sumner School. We do have a lithograph drawing in the 1872 Board of Education meeting minutes. So that's the oldest visual rendering or drawing of the school, but this is the oldest photograph, 1890. And the image on the right is the school at the year 1902. So the historic school site is one of the first public schools built for African-American students. The school was completed in 1872 by a German architect who designed it, Adolf Klus. and currently exists as one of the very few almost fully intact Reconstruction era African-American public schools, and quite possibly the only in the nation. And since this is a Capitol Hill specific group, I would like to share that Adolph Klusa has another very popular building right on the hill, which is Eastern Market. Is their space. It's a space that he designed. So I want to get into how the DC Public Education History Museum came about and how it came about in this space. So after about a century of existence, the roof collapsed in the third floor of the building. So if you see where on the left, the image from the left shows the Charles Sumner School in pretty bad shape. This was before the building was raised. It was actually scheduled to be demolished after the roof collapsed. But what ended up happening is the man in the center, Richard L. Hurlbut, he was an administrator within DC Public Schools, the historic preservation officer, and actually the foundation of our documents that we have, our vertical files, they were his files. So he was the person that people would go to in the District of Columbia public school system if they needed to know anything about the history of the schools. So he threatened to stand on the rooftop when the wrecking ball was coming. And then citizens later formed a human chain around the building to prevent it from being demolished. So that story is true about him, standing, not standing, he didn't get there, but he threatened to stand on the rooftop. It's a very dramatic story, but what I like to share with people when we tell that story is that he took action and that they organized and were able to agree to a point where there was a public-private partnership that still exists today, where the city was involved, a private entity, Boston Properties, that would care for the property, and then the DC School Board at the time, and this is the late 1970s, they agreed that this will become the official museum and archives for DC public education. It was chartered as such in 1986, and we have been collecting and preserving the history of the entire system for that long, so now almost 40 years. It exists, it's very significant in DC history, and also as far as the nation. There is no other comprehensive museum or archives or museum or archives that has comprehensive history of a city or municipality anywhere in the United States. And I've discovered that when we have researchers that are doing various topics where they want to compare city histories, such as comparing curriculums or comparing ROTC programs or anything that is kind of common within school systems across the nation, I hear about the dearth of materials, and people are just amazed at how much is housed in this building. So what they did almost 40 years was pioneering and really serves as a benchmark to how this can be done and also why it's significant. So the image on the right is the beautiful new Charles Sumner School. That photograph is circa 1990 after they did the repointing of the bricks after the renovation. So it was a couple of years after the renovation. So moving on, the question about why DC public school history matters, why is it important? The images in the frame here on the slide, one to the right is the former DC Public School Chancellor Antoine Wilson viewing historic archives. That was a very pivotal moment whenever you have people within the system coming in to understand that these documents exist, that these records, that these archives exist. It's just a wonderful viewpoint into the system history, because the next point I'm going to make is that there's nothing new under the sun. And so the collection serves as a blueprint and roadmap for present and future. So for example, within the collection, there's documentation from the 1930s where teachers are disputing the evaluation process, for example, or evaluation methods. Those are things that we hear about today. DC education history also runs parallel with our city's history, particularly when you think about the way the politics are in Washington, DC. The first elected seats were the school board. And we had a mayor that came from the school board. Mayor Marion Barry was actually on the school board, and there are other elected officials that will be the route to city seat for DC. So that's another kind of interesting occurrence. The first elections were in 1968. The two images on the left are the children. Of course, DC Public School history matters for students to see themselves in the system, to see themselves represented. Also, recalling, documenting, and preserving this history fosters a sense of pride. So that's another aspect with the museum and why that's important. Learning from the past to make for a better future as well. So there are numerous reasons why the history matters. And again, I'm very grateful to Richard Hurlbut and all these other people who created the space. They could have done anything with the revitalization of this building, and for them to charter it as the official museum and archives for DC Public Schools is quite significant. So I will circle back a little bit later and talk about how the museum is important, particularly as it pertains to stakeholders and other partners. But I do want to jump into some of the content within the collection and share a little bit of history that you can find in our collection and that pertains to the evolution of education in our city's history. So the first part is going back to the very beginning. The origins of DC public education go back to 1804, 1805. And you'll see an image on this slide of then seated President Thomas Jefferson, who actually started public education in DC. You also see a very blurry image here, and I took I used this photograph for a reason. This is the 1804, 1805 Board of Education meeting minutes. So we have them going back that far, referencing Thomas Jefferson as the president and the other board of trustees. Of course, that school system that started in 1804, 1805 was not for everybody. Everyone was not educated. As far as this early public school system, there was also certain aspects where you had to pay a certain amount for school, and it was very much aligned with socioeconomic status as well as race, obviously. So again, we have the recordings of the Board of Education meeting minutes dating back to 1804, 1805, and I'm very excited to share that one of our accomplishments last year was being awarded a Save America's Treasures grant from the National Park Service, which will allow us to have conservation work performed on that particular document and others as well that you'll see throughout the slideshow. So that's where the origins of DC public education began. I structured a timeline of just some particular aspects of the history, just again, because we will be here for a very long time trying to run through the 220-year history. And again, this is also to entice you all to come and research and learn more and really use the archives. So again, I went over that 1804, it's the City Council passes the first Public Education Act, and 1805, the Board of Trustees meets, and Thomas Jefferson is the board president. As far as African-American schools don't come until after the end of slavery, when slavery is abolished, which is 9 months ahead of Emancipation Proclamation. So every April 16th, we celebrate DC Emancipation Day, and soon thereafter, schools were provided for African-American students. But prior to that, there were private schools for Black students in DC as early as 1807. You see the first superintendent, Zalman Richards, who comes on board in 1869. The first public high school for African-American students opens in 1870. And that is quite significant because that is connected to Myrtilla Minor, who, as you can see on the timeline, comes in 1851 and opens a school for African-American girls. The site of that school is located where the Christian Heinrich House Museum is currently in DuPont Circle, right at New Hampshire Avenue and O Street, I believe. And that's where that land was that she acquired. So when she died, the land was sold and money was allocated from that fund to start a preparatory school for colored youth, which would assist with recruiting and placing teachers in these newly created schools for the free populations of African Americans in DC. In 1873, you start seeing the first normal, which are schools for teachers, and vocational schools opening. In 1876, 1877, you have the first high schools for white students open, and that school is what becomes Central High School, which was formerly located in what is now Cardozo High School. The location before that was across from the Old Street Market on 7th Street, which is now Giant Grocery Store. Then you have alternative, well, other parts of the development of curriculum that are development. So you have developed. So 1889, you see the introduction of physical education into the curriculum. In 1898, the introduction of kindergarten as well. Jumping ahead, there are some things that happen within that first half century, but another pivotal moment is 1954 Bowling versus Sharp case, where DC public schools desegregate. In the 1970s, you have the new age of school buildings. In 1995, the DC School Reform Act establishes charter schools, and Washington, DC is the first city in the US to have charter schools. And we'll talk a little bit about more modern and contemporary movements. So I mentioned DC Emancipation Day, first freed, and I have here a photograph of one of the first high school diplomas, a diploma from one of the first graduates of the first Black high school for Black students in the nation. So this is John H. Parker, 1877 was the year. And this is a part of our collection. And I included this here as well, because it's also part of the Save America's Treasures grant. And as you can see, there's mold on this diploma as underneath the layers, as it was glued to a board. Of course, the person who did it did not intentionally think that it would cause this kind of inherent vice and issue, but it has, and we are fortunate that we were able to receive a grant to take care of it. So that's another item that you will see be totally conserved, and hopefully we can put it on display at the museum in the future. Additionally, as I'm really kind of focusing on segregated Washington as it really impacted the schools, this is a map that is popular with Jen and Story of Our Schools project as well. It is just such a great showing of how the schools were segregated. On this photograph, the schools that are red are the white schools, and the schools that are printed in blue are the African-American schools. And again, you have to come to see it in person. This is not the best image, but you can see what it looks like, right? And how that's structured. Another aspect of after post desegregation is boundaries changed as well. Also, what was happening throughout that you'll see documented in the record is that as populations shifted and as more neighborhoods became populated with more Black residents who were coming from the South, you saw schools that moved from being white schools to Black schools. So one in particular, I can't think of any off the top of my head from Capitol Hill. What comes to mind often is Cleveland Elementary School, which is located on 8th Street. So not far, it's off of the U Street corridor. So that was happening in the 1930s and 40s as populations were shifting in various neighborhoods. I included a particular, I call this a case in reverse integration. And this is the case of Carla Galarza. It's Carla Galarza versus Washington, DC Board of Education, was what would have been a court case if it had gone there, but it did not. But this is the case of a white student who gained entry into a Black school in Washington, DC, and then protested after they told her she couldn't attend there because she was the only white student. So it's very rare, if ever, do you hear of white students attempting to integrate or come into Black schools, but it happened. There's a case here in Washington, DC. The school is Margaret Murray Washington Vocational High School. And her father was a former officer of the Pan American Union. So she actually was based initially in Sacramento and ended up in Washington, D.C. And her father had high regard for a dressmaker instructor at the school and wanted his daughter to study under that individual. So there was a whole situation where her father got a legal team together, including Charles Hamilton Houston and others, the NAACP and others, but they decided to not take it fully to court. But I just think this is very interesting when you just look at the dynamics. There's never anything that's one way or the not. There's no absolutes. That's why the research is just very important. And of course, 1954, Bowling versus Sharp and school desegregation. This is one of the 5 companion cases that was part of Brown versus Board of Education. So Washington, D.C., unlike most places, desegregated immediately. So the decision was in May of 1954. And for the fall of 1954, desegregation started. Now, it's not that simple. It's very complex. And that's another area that I would love to see more scholarship around. I think that there's just been a quick kind of, oh, this is Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. It's one of the companion cases. And yes, of course, they segregated right away. But there are complexities to how that happened. There were boundaries that were redrawn after the decision. And in a lot of cases, we've done oral histories. We have oral histories on file at the museum as well, where individuals talk about how they were one of 10. So it was a small grouping. So there's just a lot more to explore there. The image here is of an overcrowded classroom in Cardozo High School. And so that shows just what was happening, that the Black schools were just extremely overcrowded, and that was due to the large influx and changing of the demographics in the neighborhood and not enough schools to service them. So I want to talk a little bit about contemporary movements and also, how that impacts the collection and also our preservation, and also just considering how history is being made every day and how we capture that, which is also connected to some of the work that Jen Harris is doing with Story of Our Schools. But just very quickly, even though this is the 1960s, I consider it still more contemporary movements. And so I gave an example such as the tracking system was denounced in 1967. Euphemia Lofton Haynes became the first woman to chair the Board of Education. And immediately when she came in 1966, she really attacked what was called a tracking system, where they were tracking students for either academic or a vocational. And she argued that it was discriminatory, and actually that ruling was founded to be the case and was denounced in 1967. The 1970s is the era of modern school buildings. And when I say modern in the 1970s, I'm speaking of kind of these open space school buildings that you see. One of them, the buildings that were built in the 70s, is the newer Dunbar that's now been demolished. There's H.D. Woodson has been demolished. You might hear a trend there that a lot of these buildings are no longer, they were rebuilt or modernized. I already mentioned 1995, the public charter school movement that changed the dynamic of schools. This whole option of school choice came about, and that's been a highly charged movement, not just in Washington, D.C., but the nation. And 2000s, when I entered, I've been at the Sumner Museum for 15 years in June. And I came right at a pivotal moment, a historic moment, where 24 schools closed at one time, which never happened. 23 actually closed at one time, which never happened. Subsequently, 2 years later, about another 16 in one fell swoop. And simultaneously, there was a lot of school modernization that was going on under then City Administrator Alan Liu. There was a lot of modernization, as you will, in this not so much building new modern buildings, but in some cases it was new modern buildings, and others it was just upgrading an old building, such as Central Cardozo building went through modernization, where a lot of architects came to our site to make sure that doors and windows were correct or appropriate to honor the historic architectural integrity of the building. So that was kind of a new movement. So these images that I have here to the right, I included this one in particular to the far right. These are document boxes of the collection from Stuart Hobson, which is located on the Hill. And it just shows the wave and shift when that school was going through modernization. All of these materials were discovered there. And that school actually raised funds, and they even hired an archivist, and they ended up preserving a lot of the material. But as school leadership transitions and people come and go, they ended up really needing a home for this material. Luckily, it had been cared for, it had been rehoused and inventoried and all of that. And it's now stored at Sumner Museum because there was just no space or real interest in keeping that program going. I hope that's something that comes back. I think it was a real good win for the students. Also, this image to the left is unfortunately how we sometimes find material stored in our building, in our school buildings. So as we move forward, the relevance, evolution, and future of the museum, yes, we preserve and collect all of this material. Yes, we have these documents dating back to 1804, but why does that really matter? So these particular images show that a little bit. The image to the far left is a group of teachers who came for a summer workshop to figure out ways that they can incorporate various material culture documents in their classrooms. In the center is an old friend of the museum who's now deceased. He's now an ancestor. That is Garnet Wilkinson Hammond. He was actually named after the first African-American assistant superintendent of schools. And he passed away in 2018, I believe, and he was 96 years old. And so that's him standing next to his commission that he received from ROTC. And that image is actually when he served in World War II. But he came out of Dunbar High School. Below is an image of two ladies just enjoying the museum for an open house and connecting with objects and just finding relevance there. I also have this beautiful portrait to the right. Is one of my favorites. It's a teacher who's also now deceased, but I had the privilege of meeting her. Her name is Betty Brooks. And this is an image of her with students at, I believe this is Amadon. She was one of the first Black teachers at Amadon Elementary School. And, you know, I look at this image because I actually did an oral history with someone who had her as a teacher. And he's now about 70 years old, and he has memories of her that have impacted him his entire life. So again, people, not just children, but everyone, they find themselves in the collection. And even those who are not from DC, everybody's been to school. So there's always a connection there as well. And continuing on, we do a lot of community engagement. We have the Hurlbut Walker Memorial Research Forum, named for Richard Hurlbut, who was the main person behind saving the Sumner School. Walker is James Dent Walker, who was the first archivist at Sumner Museum, and both of them are the reason why the collection even exists. We have DC Public School Pride open house events. You see some images there. We have really amped up virtual programs because of the pandemic, of course. So that has actually broadened our relevancy and presence as well. A series of special events. And we also have volunteer and internship programs. You'll see a young conservation student working on a portrait there of H.D. Woodson. And finally, this will conclude my portion of the presentation as it pertains to partnerships, because that's really what we're talking about. I'm so excited again to share this space with Jen Harris, who's doing wonderful work with Story of Our Schools project. That's one of her famous photographs of me holding the former crest for DC Public Schools with some very engaged students. And I'm sure she remembers what school those children are from, and she'll tell us when we get there, but I don't recall because we've worked with so many. I also placed a couple of iterations and collaborations I've had with other people. This is Separate Ever Equal. This was a multimedia exhibit that was done by a member of the community through the DC Arts and Humanities Commission, and she used a lot of of media, photographs, and other materials from our collection for this multimedia exhibit. And the top image to the left, an educational shift, the Latino presence in DC public schools, as we talk about relevance and how we're trying to broaden the context of the collection. I was very concerned coming to the museum 15 years ago about how Black and white the collection is, and as far as how we interpret it and talk about other groups within the system as well. So kind of a scratching the surface, we collaborated with the Smithsonian Latino Center in 2012 to put on this public program that kind of delved into the large influx of students who ended up in the public school system who were coming from Central America in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So it was really wonderful. It was very eye-opening. We were able to add to the collection and also got some intel that, you know, that now it's time to talk about the following generations, because there's a whole nother generation since that happened, which has a whole nother set of interpretive themes and things to discuss. So this concludes my portion. I hope that this was a good kind of overview and gives you a taste of what we have in the museum. I am so excited to pass the mic, if you will, to Jen Harris, who's going to talk about the Story of Our Schools project partnership, something that it's one of our favorite partnerships because it really allows us to connect young people to our collection in ways that we wouldn't be able to ordinarily, and get these beautiful exhibitions with the support of not just our repository, but others in the city, have the students like touching, these are little kids, these are fourth graders in this picture, who are looking at original documents and just using critical thinking skills to sort through the history and come up with ideas. And Jen's going to tell you how it's all done, but it's really beautiful to witness. And it's been one of my greatest joys over the past several years working with Jen. And so with that, we'll hold questions until the end, but I'm going to pass the mic to Jen Harris, Story of Our Schools project.
Thank you, Kimberly. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was such a wonderful introduction. And Kimberly, right back at you. Working with you is just so much fun. And I will get into why it's so important in my slides. But I'm excited to be with you all tonight as we discuss the story behind our DC schools. You just heard a great presentation from Kimberly about the history of our schools here in DC. And so now I'm going to pick up and talk about how my organization engages students and local communities around this history. Then quickly, I'll dive into the history behind Payne Elementary School, which was one of our partner schools. So to start, Story of Our Schools was established in 2015. We are a DC-based 501c3 nonprofit. We believe that more than a place of learning, schools are anchors and reflections of the neighborhoods they serve. And today we have a unique opportunity to capture their stories to develop a cultural and historical understanding of our city's origins. So basically, we run programs in DC schools that empower students to research and uncover the history of their school and the surrounding neighborhood. We then create a permanent museum quality exhibit installed in their school lobby that shares their findings with the broader community. So the two photographs here, the top one is of my Oyster Adams kids at Kimberly's archives, and the bottom one is of their final exhibit in their school lobby. Kimberly, next slide, please. Since 2015, we've partnered with 7 schools across the district. You'll see a lot of Capitol Hill schools in that mix. And we currently have 14 schools that are interested in partnering with us. Next slide. So I'm going to dive a little bit into the Payne Elementary partnership. This one started out like most of our partnerships do. Payne administration reached out to us in 2018 seeking a partnership with the Story of Our Schools. So Principal Bird at the time was looking for a project that could honor the generations of families who had attended the school, but also the surrounding neighborhood was quickly gentrifying, and she thought that a final exhibit could commemorate the school and how it's grown over time. Mark Jordan, who is the PTA president, he wanted a project that would help the school celebrate their history, as well as build stronger bridges among the families who attended the school. Next. So our partnership with the school, like every project, the Story of Our Schools team does an initial research dig, and we go to places like Sumner Archives, that's the first place we go, MLK Library, the DC History Center. And my team, just at a very high level, looks for historical research about what a school story can entail. We then take all those findings and we ingest them into our curriculum. Our curriculum is DCPS aligned, and it basically acts as a roadmap. We do not bring in our own teachers. We partner with teachers from our partner school. So Payne Elementary, they wanted to run an after-school program with a small group of students in grades 2 through 5. And our partner teachers were Miss Stokes and Miss Brown. And after meeting them, I knew the project was going to be a success because they, one, are passionate teachers. They had been at the school forever. And Miss Brown was actually an alumni and grew up in the neighborhood. So I knew right away they had an invested interest in running the project. So what did our kids get to do? So they got to do hands-on research at local archives. Kimberly, actually, that picture that she showed you all, those were my Payne Elementary kids. They got to learn how to conduct oral history interviews, and they would interview longtime area residents. Of course, we took field trips to museums. There's a lot of them around DC, so we utilized everyone that had relevant content to their coursework. Historical walking tours around the neighborhood, so they got to determine old buildings, what's new, what has been there forever. And then guest speakers would also come and visit our kids. And what I loved about the Payne Elementary project was that our small group of kids that were actually working with the content, they became ambassadors. So for example, they would learn about Daniel A. Payne, who is their school's namesake, and they would create a song and then perform it for other students during their lunch period. So again, how do we get, the small, tight group of kids, how do we get all that information out to the rest of the school community? And during the process, that's just one way that they could do it. So once the research is completed, once the research is completed, we hand the content and the exhibit design off to an exhibit review committee. To me, this is one of the most important steps in our process. This committee includes invested school community members. So again, this isn't Jen Harris's view of history. This isn't Kimberly Springle's view. This is an exhibit created by a school community for a school community. So this committee ensures that language and content is appropriate for the school. And then once they send back their edits, the Story of Our Schools team creates all the files and design, and then we hand everything off to exhibit professionals to create and build the exhibits. Next, Kimberly, please. And this was the final product for Payne Elementary School. So their exhibit was called The Story of Daniel A. Payne in Our School. The 2 photographs up top show the exhibit. They're both in the same lobby, just in different parts of their lobby. And all of our exhibits kind of look like this. It's, they've got photographs and text and big photo murals, but we use their available space. So each of these exhibits are custom designed to fit in the school. They are the same quality that you'll find at the Smithsonian because they have to last. This is a busy school, right? You've got kids running in and out. And I can tell you that even our first exhibit that we installed in 2017, it looks as beautiful as the day we installed it. These materials are just made to last. And that's why they're expensive, right? And then all the little photographs on the bottom, that's our reveal event at Payne. If a school wants, and they usually do, we like to co-host a celebration to celebrate the hard work of the students, the new exhibit. We have a kids activity table. The kids who participate in the program, they get to speak. We also ask them to be docents, so they lead visitors through the exhibit. We'll have a guest speaker. Chairman Mendelson came to the Payne reveal. Families, community members, everybody's invited to celebrate this work. Okay, next, Kimberly. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the meat of their exhibit. So this is what our kids found out. And I'm just going to dive right in. So the original Payne Elementary School was built in 1896 to serve Black students. At that time, Washington, D.C. schools were segregated by race. As the city grew, many of the Black schools became overcrowded and fell into disrepair, while nearby white schools were renovated and operated under capacity. So to the left, you see this beautiful black and white image of the original Payne Elementary School. That's from Kimberly's archives. And we actually were able to find the original architectural drawings through DC Public Schools. So just for the presentation, I have an elevation view, but the kids actually got to work with plans so they could see the plan view of the classrooms and how everything was set up. Oh, and also because we are building these exhibits and we're not writing a research paper, these visuals become extremely important. You know, we can't have long copy blocks. We need to have this really great imagery to get people excited about the exhibit. Okay, Kimberly, go ahead. Next slide, please. In the late 1940s, parents of Payne Elementary students joined other Black parents living east of the Anacostia River to speak out about the deplorable conditions of their aging schools. They led a series of protests during which they kept their children home from school. Their activism contributed to the landmark 1954 case of Bowling versus Sharp that ended DC school segregation. So Kimberly touched on this. And this is also, we found this great article from 1953, and this was part of our initial research dig, right? When we're just trying to find out what's out there during the summer. So this article came from DC Public Library, but we were able to find all these resources, Xerox them, and put them into our curriculum so our kids could work with them. Go ahead, Kimberly, next slide. And now we're bringing in student voices. Remember, I said we teach our kids how to conduct oral histories. So for those of you who are familiar with the neighborhood that surrounds Payne Elementary, Peter Bug Shoe Repair is right down the street. And so he came in and our kids interviewed him. And it was most of our interviews last like 45 minutes to an hour, but we pull quotes, right? So he told our students, Payne was crowded. It was the only neighborhood school that accepted Black children at the time. Before schools desegregated, you could not go. I could not go to Bryan or Buchanan. But how about this? After 1954, they started letting Black people in. So this community, this oral history just brought that last section to life, right? Like you can read about it, you can research it, but until you have that personal story, I think for our kids, it just kind of, it brings it to life. Okay, next slide, Kimberly. The DC School Board finally recognized the need for structural changes to Payne Elementary. In the 50s and 60s, several ideas were attempted to relieve the overcrowding, such as placing kindergarten students on a 4-day schedule, borrowing a floor from a nearby school. They also tried establishing portable units, which finally led to the creation of permanent annexes to the existing building. In 1983, a fire broke out, destroying the original building, but the annexes remained undamaged, and students moved into these buildings permanently. So we found this great photo of Payne actually on fire. You see the hook and ladder and the kids and people standing outside. Next slide. And my team did a little digging, and we actually found one of the firefighters, who is now retired, who put out that fire. So he came in with one of his friends to talk to our students about what that was like. He said, I was cleaning paintbrushes out back of the firehouse. It was spring cleaning, and we were doing a little painting in the morning. And about at 11 o'clock, smoke started filling the parking lot. So I started looking around, and a lady on 16th Street sitting on her back porch says, I think it's coming from the school. So I ran through the firehouse, stood out front, and the whole attic of the school was on fire, just that quick. Next, Kimberly. And to add to that, we interviewed Sam Bardley. Sam Bardley is a longtime, he's a Washington native, grew up in the community, Payne alumni. His daughter, at the time of this project, went to Payne. And he actually, in 1983, as a student, was coming home from a field trip when he saw his school building on fire. So again, just adding that other perspective, we have the firefighter and the student to talk about what that event was like. He also told our students, we had a lot of fun in 3rd grade. They just instituted the Gifted and Talented program, and I got put into that. They let us do more creative stuff like sculpture, advanced mathematics, and things like that. Miss Lee really pushed me to participate in the program. Next. The building structure remained unchanged until a 2014 modernization transformed the facility into a modern learning environment. Over 2 consecutive summers, every instructional, administration, and auxiliary space was renovated. Information technology systems were added to every classroom, including specialized systems for students in Payne's deaf and hard of hearing program. Finally, the construction of a new walkway and an elevator made the school accessible to individuals with physical disabilities. Next. So that was the building's history, right? That was part of the building history exhibit. Now the kids really wanted to dig into who was Daniel A. Payne. And Daniel A. Payne is pretty remarkable, and there is a ton of information about him. So we have to teach our kids, again, because we're creating an exhibit, we're not writing a research paper, we can't get bogged down with a long biography. So we teach them how to create timelines. We need the most important parts of his life and what was happening nationally so we can piece together his story, right? So you can see here in the middle, there's a timeline with one of my kids was filling in his notes as to what he thought the most important parts of his life was. So very quickly, Daniel Alexander Payne was born free of slavery in Charleston, South Carolina in 1811. He opened his first school for Black children at the age of 19. But after Nat Turner's rebellion, Payne was forced to close his school and he moved north. He continued to educate and support people of color. In 47, he married his first wife. And then in 56, he helped found Wilberforce University in Ohio, which is still standing today. And he became the first Black president of a university in the United States. And then just to put this all into context, right, then the American Civil War happened. So all of this stuff happened before that war even began. And then at 82 years old, Daniel Payne dies in Ohio. Another thing that we found during that initial research dig when we were building out the curriculum was Frederick Douglass wrote a letter, and we found it at the Library of Congress. And he wrote it at the time of Daniel Payne's death. So it was a pretty long letter. I want to say it was 2 or 3 pages. And he just talked about Daniel's life and legacy, right? Like why this man was so important and why he'll be missed. So we took a couple of quotes from that, but this one is pretty big in the exhibit. And Frederick Douglass said, he carried the torchlight of education wherever he went. Okay, Kimberly, next. Okay, so that you can find out more about the exhibit on our website. You can actually read all the exhibits on our website. You just have to go to the school page. But I would just want to wrap up with how we tell the stories behind our DC schools. So our projects always start with primary archival research and are history based. That's why places like the Sumner archives are so important. We need to have that factual base, that foundation before we even get started. Student and community input gives our projects their voice. It's these personal stories like from Sam Bardley and Peter Bugg that bring this history to life. Students, staff, and families learn about and become a part of their school's history. Exhibits, of course, become this pride point for school communities and future generations. And lastly, the exhibits also inspire additional projects and spark conversations about current topics that affect the school today. Okay, Kimberly, this is the last slide. That's it. Thank you all.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Jen and Kimberly. This is fascinating. So as far as questions go, there's a couple accolades in the chat box. And there's one, what is it? I closed it just now. And I don't know. 1969 first elected Board of Education, I believe. I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment. But anyway, if others have, if anyone has any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask it. And we'll kind of just whoever speaks up first. We want to make it kind of informal. Any questions? I can look in my notes. So my kids went to Maury Elementary School, and I don't know, I know you really focused on Payne Elementary, and I was curious about if you know much about Maury. One thing I'm curious about as far as historical history goes is was talk about renaming the school because Maury apparently was a slaveholder. And then I heard that some people in the community didn't want to change it. And I don't know, I'm sure it's controversial, but I was kind of curious if you had any thoughts about about that or other things with that as far as renaming of schools. I know Wilson changed its name um, to honor, I think it was to honor August Wilson, but I'm not sure completely because the name looks different. But anyway.
The school, they did end up changing the name of Wilson to Jackson Reed,
Yeah.
name for Edna Burke Jackson, who was the one of the first African American teachers at Wilson, and Jackson Reed, who was the first Black principal and later was the superintendent of schools. But yes, the school naming, that's something with a whole, that it's not, again, I talk about how DC, we have these things, but it's a nationwide thing that's come about, including the removing of memorial statues to Confederates and all of that. All I can say about it is people should do their research, first and foremost, coming from a historian, archivist, just research, because there was another, and I'll give an example. There was also talk about removing Frank Ballou's name from Ballou High School. And for me, I will share my opinion about that, is that that was problematic for me. What ended up happening is people heard this story, which is actually true, about Marian Anderson. She ended up singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. She was first denied at, what's the name of the
DAR?
DAR, thank you. She was first denied there. And a lot of people don't know this, but the next place they approached was the school system for Central High School, which was then a white school. But another fun fact, the Central High School stage used to be the largest in the city. Now that's pre-renovation. I don't know what they did, but it was one of the largest, it was the largest stage in the city. So Frank Ballou was encountered about her performing there, and he said no. But my argument is that the schools were segregated. This is an outside performance. It had nothing to do with the schools, and his reign is the school. So my thought is he probably didn't want to get involved in all the politics of that. And so people said, well, Frank Ballou's a segregationist, so his name should be removed. And I'm like, not really. You should do your research about Frank Ballou and really understand who he was as an individual. And my argument was also, he's no more of a segregationist than Garnett C. Wilkinson was, as the first assistant African-American superintendent. So as far as just those discussions, I don't think that there is a one size fit all for these things. But I definitely think they're worthy of discussion, because I understand why certain names and certain individuals are controversial, but I just think thorough research should be done. That's my 2 cents about it.
To piggyback on that, school namesakes come up all the time in our projects. So when our kids dig into the life and legacy of each of these people, we ask them, would you keep the school's name the same, or would you change it? And sometimes it's 50-50 one way, sometimes it's one way or the other. But it's cool to see the kids debate it, come up with your reasonings. You have the research in front of you, why do you think it's one way or the other? The one that comes to my mind, Kimberly, is Capitol Hill Montessori at Logan. Logan's career started off, he was very racist, right? But then when the country went to Civil War, he had a change of heart. So it wasn't so black and white. I mean, if you're going to take the first part of his life, or you're going to take the second part of his life, or it's a full life though, right? So I agree. It's very sticky, but I agree with Kimberly that you have to do your research.
Do others have questions? Oh, I see, Robert, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Hey, everybody. My name is Robert Byrne, and I help manage social media for Central Office. So this has been an endlessly fascinating conversation. Just thank you so much for everything. So much has stuck out that I was not even aware of throughout this conversation. particularly the case of Carla Galarza, which is so interesting. But since you guys have spent years working with the students and sharing these stories, it's a very selfish question, but I'm currently putting together all of our posts for Black History Month. And I'm curious for your expertise on what stories have particularly resonated with the students, if there's any must-haves for that particular campaign.
I would have to think on it.
Fair.
A lot. But yeah, I'm happy to think on it. Kimberly, what sticks out to you?
I mean, there's so much. It's just a lot. Maybe I'm biased because of my role, but the DC public school history is just fascinating. There's so many things that happen here as first. Our students love the Sumner School. This is also a selfish push, and the Sumner is 150, so that would be excellent for your campaign to talk about the Sumner School. Particularly, we're looking to do a celebration that actually coincides with DC Emancipation Day, because again, I know you're speaking to Black History Month, but DC Emancipation Day, I still feel like gets lost on the students because they're generally on spring break. So when I'm out talking to even high schoolers, a lot of them are unaware of that significance, particularly now that we have a Juneteenth federal holiday, which is technically the last to know about freedom in Galveston, Texas. But guess what? DC is first freed 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. So I think that is fascinating. The Sumner School is a Reconstruction era building. Very few, if any, are left in the country that represent that history, that scholarship about Reconstruction period is a huge dearth in the nation's narrative period. And that includes DC. So that's fascinating to know that this Reconstruction era building still exists right downtown. Someone asked where it's located, 17th and M Street, Northwest, right across from National Geographic. But there's so much history that's perfect for your campaign, but I'm going to push for the Sumner School being recognized in its 150th year and what it meant post-emancipation, post-abolition of slavery, as far as educational institutions being developed in the city of Washington, D.C.
Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. I remember Mr. Hurlburt was a wonderful person. When we were trying to get our school on the historical registry, he was such a great help to us. And then when we had our first reunion for the military road school, my sister talked with him and he invited us to come down and hold our reunion there. But I remember him telling me a story about the fact that when the school was in danger of being struck down by that construction ball, the mayor, he'd gone to see the mayor, and the mayor had promised him that they wouldn't touch it and it wouldn't stand. But that Thursday or Friday of that weekend, the equipment rolled up the street right there at the building. He was really scared. He got on the phone or went down there and told the mayor, "You told me you were going to save our building, and now here's all this stuff out here. What are they going to do?" And so when he came back, though, on Monday morning, it was still there because he was willing to stand out there and not allow any equipment to touch that building. And that's such a wonderful story that I really never forgot. In fact, he was very helpful to anyone that wanted to find out about Sumner or do things at Sumner or whatever. He was just a grand person to deal with, and he inspired us to do much.
Thanks for that, Pat. That's really good to hear. We always want to make sure we still honor him. These people passed through, and his legacy is sitting there right on 17th and M Street. And because of him, we can boast that we're the only museum and archives for public school system in the country because of his hard work and others. But he was definitely leading the charge.
I actually wrote down in my notes when Payne Elementary School. So that was a really beautiful building. So was it all destroyed during the fire? and just totally razed for the new modernization project?
So the research that I found and talking to the firefighter who actually remembered quite a lot of it, he said that the attic was destroyed. I think it was an electrical fire, but the whole building, from my understanding, was not destroyed, but they demolished the whole building after the attic was on fire.
Hmm.
And those annexes that I was talking about, that's actually what you see today. That's Payne's building now, are those annexes. And the building, if you're familiar with the community where Payne's tennis court is now, that's where that original building was, right there on the corner.
I see Teresa has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say how much I've enjoyed the presentation, and it's not a question, but it's more of a comment from to Ms. Springle to remind you that as we spoke last year, and I promised, we at the Military Road School are going to be contacting you this year regarding some artifacts we have from the Military Road School. There are only a few of us left, who were there when it closed in 1954, and one or two others before that period. But we are preserving those artifacts, and we will be contacting you this year.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Wonderful to hear your voice, Teresa.
Well, the pandemic slowed us down from
Yes.
doing oral, presentations, but we are still very strong in preserving the history. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Andrea?
Hi, thank you so much for this fascinating history and discussion. I'm interested to know if the museum is doing work to preserve the history of schools that have been sold to developers for apartments, and how much work is being done around those decisions, if they were, the involvement of DCPS or how that happened, the history of the schools that have been transformed, and making sure that we keep records of that evolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for your question. That has been a challenge. I will say that the Sumner School Museum and Archives is a staff of 2, so it gets really complicated. And I'll tell you what I have been working on incessantly is really kind of formalizing processes for preservation, but that's a big undertaking to translate that and make sure it happens. But on a smaller scale, first, I'll run the timeline back. There are a lot, Capitol Hill, let's talk about Capitol Hill and a lot of the schools that have been sold to developers for condominiums. That Capitol Hill is the place. There are probably more schools that were transformed that way early than anywhere else in the city, including, I think the first kind of example was, can't recall the name of that school, but what's now Results Gym, right? And some of these things predate there even being a museum. So I'll first talk about the timeline that we're a baby museum. We just started in 1986. But thanks to Richard Hurlwood, he had, literally we have vertical files on every single school that ever existed. So in that regard, the history is there. What is the challenge is the material culture and the objects that end up being stored in these 100-plus-year-old schools, and the loss that has occurred with rapid changeover and selling off. So we do the best that we can. What I try to do on the larger scale is just impress upon, the powers that be within the city about how important it is to preserve the history. That's why Jen Harris's work is so critical, because yes, we have the archives. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand what archives are all about, but being able to see a beautiful exhibition on the wall, which we hope to be able to have resources to do more of that at our site. But Jen's doing it in the schools, which is fabulous. So it's not just that these beautiful exhibits exist there, but that the students are involved in putting it together. They're interviewing people. It's this intergenerational component. There's a learning component. You know, some of these kids may grow up and become curators or photographers, or you never know what will blossom from these early phases. I know I'm getting off the topic, but the point is that all of this work contributes to really placing the value on why it's important to make sure the history is preserved, that they're not just buildings, you know, that can be parceled out and sold and turned into other places, but there are stories there. There are people that have experiences in these buildings. There are people that have walked in the building that I know that went to the new Hine that got torn down where the Trader Joe's and all that is on the hill, in tears about it. You know, these are young adults. That was their school, and it holds a place in their lives. So the fact that Sumner School Museum and Archives exists, the fact that Richard Hurlbut and those folks chartered this museum, whether they knew it was going to happen or not, they had no idea that all this would happen. This was pre-public charters. This is pre, rapid school closures and all the things that were to come. But these people believed in the history and preservation of this history. And so we have that foundation, and therefore we're building upon that. So we're very much, we're the place where you can find the information. What we want to do is make sure that it continues, that we're able to capture stories, that we're able to protect as much material culture that we can and bring it into the space and preserve it.
When we think about growing the story of our schools, an idea that always comes up is, what about these condos that move into where schools used to be? And I would love to put our exhibits on the ground floor of a condo. You know, that's the thing. Exhibits can fit any space. It doesn't have to be a school, doesn't have to be a museum, you know, it could be, they can be outside, you know?
Yeah.
And again, we'd need a big old grant to do that, but I would love that to be an option.
But people are interested. So we've had researchers. So now what comes to mind when Jen, you said that, there's a young man who he's like a hobbyist photographer. He's into photography and he knows how to make stuff look real good and frame it up. So his girlfriend or fiance lives in a building. It may or may not be on the hill. I don't know, but it's a former school that's now condominium. And so as a gift, he came to Sumner to get all these historic images and documents and as much information as he could find. And he created, this framed artistic piece that she can hang in the building. And so he's talked to us he's like, I'd like to do this for other spaces. So there's the interest. So again, the foundation is that the museum exists. And so there's a point where people can go and find things and contribute things.
Yeah. And I think also when you're building that exhibit, again, to the point of you need that community input, because you really don't want to end up with an exhibit that was researched by somebody who doesn't really have any tie to that place, because then your exhibit doesn't have a voice. Kimberly, you and I have talked about this a lot. I think what makes the story of our schools exhibit so successful is it does have community voice and it is coming from a really authentic place. But I would love to see them in condos. I think what a great way.
Yes.
That's a great question.
I was going to say, I knew Dick Hurlbut, and it's a wonderful legacy. And actually, I was on the school board when we worked out that agreement with Sumner School, and forget the name of the other school, and the parking lot to build the building on the parking lot, a commercial building. And whole part of the deal was that they had to preserve and actually restore the Sumner School. I don't know that fully thought through at that time in the early 70s what it would turn into in terms of a museum, but it was to be an archive. And the just because of Charles Sumner and the historic history of just even the person it was named after. But Dick Hurlbut was a wonderful person. He wrote, a history of every single, the person that each school was named after, and put that together.
See, that's why we need everybody. So, and I need to, because another dream of mine is to pull together, because what I understand, I never met Dick Hurlbut, but I'm living out his legacy every day, so I feel connected to him. But what I see and what I understand is that he was a very kind man, and that he was always just doing for other people.
Mhm.
And I feel like his story is not fully there. So I
Yeah.
have another dream project of talking to people like you, Betty Ann, and
Mhm.
others who knew him, Pat Tyson, and getting like just oral recollections.
Yeah,
about
there
his
are
stories about
school
when I
board
put it
members
together.
still
Yep.
living from that time who served with me and knew Bill, Dick Hubbard, Bill Traynor, Ray Kemp. Who else was on the school board? Linda Kropp's husband,
Yeah.
Dwight, and they are still all here. And yeah, we could talk about.
I'll be calling you real soon, because that's something that I wanted to do. I've been wanting to do for a while and sort it out, because he was such a fascinating person, and what he did and pushing to save that building is incredible, and it's an important space. And again, it is the pivotal point that supports the work that Jen and others are doing. As it's anything to do to preserve that history, I think is very important. There's so much good impact there.
I'd like to say you all have done such a beautiful job in displaying all the things that you have in there. Are you about to run out of space?
Well, listen, we do have, what we're trying to do is, since they're not schools closing in large amounts anymore, we have the ability now where we can gain better intellectual control and really feel like, figure out the scope of the collection. Because when the schools closed, like, it was rapid response collecting, then we had to wade through. So we still have, I know a lot of in the museum world don't like this word, but we have a lot that needs to be de-accessioned. There's simply stuff in the collection that we can make room for other things. So again, the big idea is to really streamline the collection and figure out what the true scope is. It's not any and everything from the schools. That's why, again, I'll say why Jen's work is important. It's because everything that we have really shouldn't be there. The school should have space for preserving their history there. There should be appreciation within the school. I know that might sound, over ambitious, because schools have so many other things that, they're working towards, but that's why I love Jen and what she's doing, because she's going in the school building and it puts it right in their face. And then the students then become ambassadors for the time that they're there. But we're hoping that it builds like this whole momentum of like, wow, this school, my school has history. It's important. And then students become aware of what is there to collect now, what is important in my current school cultural history that people will care about 40, 50 years from now. So just building that, it's not an overnight thing, but just building that in the psyche and in the culture of our schools about its significance and about paying attention to historic images or trophies or scrapbooks or things that may be found in the school, so that they're not tossed, but salvaged, not just at the Sumner school, but maybe creating space within in the library or somewhere in the school where, hey, these are where our sacred items go, with the help of professionals. It's like a dream of mine. So yes, Pat Tyson, we do not have a building large enough to contain all of the material history of DC public schools. And that is quite the challenge. So for us as a museum, we want to figure out how we interface and what are the premium materials that we'd like to collect.
Before there was Sumner, where was it stored before, in Franklin?
Well, there was no museum before Sumner.
Okay.
Everything was stored in the bowels of schools and things of that nature. Now our oldest repository is Washingtoniana, which is now the People's Archive. I mean, there are other repositories in the city, so we're not the only place that has school memorabilia, and material. So a lot of personal collections pertaining to the schools wound up in those spaces. But really, sad to say, a lot of the materials in the schools simply were discarded over time. If a school closed, or if a school was demolished, or if a school closed and then became, an apartment building or condominium, sadly, a lot of the history has been thrown away, sadly, because there was no mechanism to save those things. And in a lot of ways, it's still a challenge, but we're doing better than most places. I'll put it that way.
The records of the Board of Education were always kept wherever the
Yes.
headquarters were, whether it's Franklin School or
That's
wherever
right.
they went, the minutes and that sort of stuff, although I think
That's
there's
correct.
probably some gaps there too.
That's correct. Thanks for that clarity. So yes, so I always, when the Board of Education meeting minutes were actually taken, the reason why we have those 1804, 1805 Board of Education meeting minutes is because of Dick Hurlbut. And I mentioned James Dent Walker, who was hired in like 1991 at Sumner. They made sure that those records were saved out of the Franklin School, which is our sister school, which was formerly headquarters for Central Office, DC Public School Central Office for many years.
Well, thank you so much. I think I'm going to have to end it here just because of the time, and I don't want to take too much advantage of all the great conversation and information that you've provided. The great thing is that I hope your presentation has opened doors for and ideas for people to be contacting you. I have a feeling you're going to get a lot of phone calls after this, which is terrific. So, and thank you so much for educating us about the things that are going on in our schools and for just basically lending your expertise for this. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for everybody who has attended and provided great insight. Pat Tyson, I'm looking at you. And thank you so much. And have a great rest of the evening. And we'll follow up. This presentation will be available on the CHRS website for people to check out as soon as we're able to put it up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.